So continuing about roundtables, we meet on the third Thursday of the month at the Civic Club. Meetings are open to the public. We meet every month except July, August, and December. So we have nine a year. Can everyone hear that? Oh. Yeah. Yeah, we meet. That sound better? Okay. All right. So I have to stay fairly close to it then. Yeah. So we meet on the third Thursday of the month at the Civic Club in Southern Pines. Last night's meeting, which was the third Thursday of the month, was our members' meeting where members do short presentations. We usually choose January for that because if it snows a half inch here, the whole state shuts down. so if we have a guest speaker for January, the airplanes may not be flying, the roads may not be usable, and everyone is hunkered down with their eggs, peanut butter, and bread. I'm used to 60 inches of snow a year from upstate New York, so I kind of chuckle when everything shuts down here. Lynn is getting ready. I'm going to get this ready. I just realized this is all backwards. I'm going to stick to script. This is a long talk. This is the first of the 6. This is the longest. The others are probably about 60 to 70 minutes so we could take a break on the other ones. This one is almost a full 90 minutes. On Wednesday, I gave this talk at North Carolina State University. They have their Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And during the pandemic, I did a series of 6 talks on Civil War medicine, myth and reality. And apparently that was so popular, they wanted me back. So this year, I'm doing it in person. And on Wednesday, I gave this talk to their group down there. And Lynn asked if I was going to do Civil War presentations again at the Senior Center, and I figured it would be a good time to do the same talk a couple of days later. So I tested out at North Carolina, and you get the finished product here. I asked if I should factor in a break at North Carolina, and I was told they don't break. So it's a full 90-minute talk. If you have to get up and go to the restroom, you get up and go to the restroom. So this talk covers basically 3 different aspects. And all my talks will be similar in the sense that I'm talking about a commonly known event, but I'm going to talk about the backstory of it that you probably don't know. So probably most people know that the shelling of Fort Sumter is the start of the Civil War. So I'm not going to re-emphasize that fact, but I'll talk about how we got to that position in the events leading up to the actual shelling, which is in some respect almost a comedy of errors and chance events. I'm also going to talk about one of the officers at Sumter, and he is credited with firing the first shot against the Confederacy from Sumter. And we'll finish up with just about 5 minutes about baseball. And how does baseball tie in with Fort Sumter? So today's talk is a question. Do you know the mythical relationship between baseball and Fort Sumter? And when you're done tonight, and when we're done with this, you'll be able to go home and you can challenge some of your friends and say, "Can you tell me if baseball and Fort Sumter are related?" And make a bet with them, and you may be able to clean up some money on a bet because you'll know the relationship between baseball and Fort Sumter. It's Lynn, oh, there she is. Okay. We really can't do anything until she's there. Mhm. Yeah, we've just been talking a little bit about roundtables. When I spoke Wednesday at North Carolina, a gentleman came up to me afterwards and said, "You didn't take a single drink during that full 90 minutes." So I said, "Yeah, wow, this is the largest group I've ever had at the senior center here." And there's the title to today's talk. Okay. Apparently, we don't have a remote to change the slides, so and the laptop wouldn't. She couldn't log in on the laptop, so she's on the tabletop desk model back there, and she's going to have to manually change the slides that are back there. Okay, Lynn, next slide. If this works. Okay, there we are. In the 1860 census, the population of Charleston was about 50,000 people. As a seaport, there were anywhere from 50 to 60 ships a day loading or unloading during the first 4 months of the year, such that the industrial output of the region was third in the South after Richmond and New Orleans. South Carolina owns several military bases: Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, and Fort Johnson. They were expensive to maintain, so the state gladly ceded them over to the United States government, along with other unspecified sites along the coastline that the Army might choose to fortify for defense purposes. The Army wished to add another fort for purposes of crossfire against the naval assault. The Corps of Engineers determined that a fort could be built on a sandbar off of Morris Island, and that would satisfy the needs of crossfire with Fort Moultrie. Could I have the next slide? Oh, go back one. Go back one to the map. Oh, you're going forward. Well, work began on the new fort, which was planned to be one of the world's greatest fortifications with the latest military ideas. The walls would be thicker and higher for the 140 cannon, and the foundations needed to be of stone because this was going to be on a sandbar. That stone, apparently there's no stone in the South, that stone was brought by ships from New York State, Vermont, and New Hampshire. So the base of Fort Sumter is stone brought down as ballast in ships and dropped on the Morris Island sandbar. The fort itself, next slide. Next, please. Would be named after General Sumter from the Revolutionary War. Next slide. And it would occupy 2.5 acres to accommodate 1,000 men and 140 cannon in 3 tiers. Guns for horizontal firing from thick wall casements would be through openings in the wall called embrasures. There were 2 large barracks and a 3-story building with offices in it. And the roofs were tiled to collect water, store in cisterns as the water supply. Next slide. The walls were slabs of concrete faced with brick, 50 feet tall and 5 feet thick. The top of the wall of the parapet was coped with massive bricks that were 18 inches thick. It was pentagon shaped, pointing out to sea with a right side and a left side. The weakest part of the fort was the gorge wall, the back wall, which faced Morris Island. That was 321 feet long, and extending from that was a 170-foot stone wharf. Next slide, please. This is a model of the fort. If you visited Fort Sumter, it doesn't look anything like this. That's because it has changed dramatically over the years. Next slide, please. Fort Moultrie, named after Revolutionary War General Moultrie, sat on a narrow strip of land on Sullivan Island. Next slide, please. It had been built during the Revolutionary War and blocked the initial sea assault of Charleston by the British. The walls of Moultrie were 16 feet thick with a brick exterior, but interior walls were nothing more than packed earth. Civilian homes bordered both sides, and over the years, wind had pushed sand dunes higher than the walls, such that cattle grazing on the beaches there could go through the embrasures and wind up on the parapets. On the east side, the sand dunes were more ominously higher, such that anyone on the top of the sand dune could look down into the fort and could fire down into the fort. Next slide, please. Castle Pinckney was on an island almost a mile from the city wharfs. Next slide. It was round-shaped and had 2 tiers of cannon behind its 20-foot thick brick walls. An ordnance sergeant and his family stayed at both Castle Pinckney and Fort Sumter. The remainder of the garrison was stationed at Fort Moultrie. In 1856, the U.S. Army consisted of about 13,000 men and 3,000 officers. Promotion of the officers was based solely on seniority. The entire Army consisted of 198 companies, and of those 198 companies, 185 of them were stationed on the western frontier. Next slide, please. This left 15 companies of about 30 men each, or about 500 soldiers, to guard the Canadian border, the Atlantic border from Maine down to Florida, and the Gulf border from Florida over to New Orleans, as well as guard the 23 arsenals that existed in the United States, 500 men. In 1860, the 1st Regiment maintained 2 companies at Fort Sumter, Company E and Company H. Company E consisted of 32 enlisted men, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, 21 privates, 1 musician, and 2 artificers. Artificers were the men who built gun carriages and maintained the gun carriages. If you Google this word, Google will say there's no such word. That's a word that has disappeared. Next slide, please. Captain Abner Doubleday commanded Company E. He was born in 1819 in Ballston Spa, which is about 30 miles north of Albany, New York. His father, Ulysses, fought in the War of 1812, and his grandfather, his paternal grandfather, also named Abner Doubleday, fought in the Revolutionary War. Doubleday grew up when his father became a representative for the city of Auburn, New York, and the county around it in the United States Congress. He grew up in Auburn, New York, but when he was about 10 years of age, he was sent to live with his uncle, who was the postmaster in Cooperstown, New York. He went there because there was a private preparatory high school there. His uncle was also named Abner Doubleday, so Abner Doubledays are frequent in the Doubleday family. In Cooperstown, there's a letter that gives some insight into how Doubleday spent his youth. Quote, "I was brought up in a bookstore and early imbibed a taste for reading. I was fond of poetry and art and much interested in mathematical studies. In my outdoor sports, I was addicted to topographical work, and even as a boy, amused myself by making maps of the country around my father's residence." Unquote. Abner practiced as a surveyor and a civil engineer for 2 years before entering the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1838. During his years at West Point, he did not leave West Point from August of 1838 until he graduated in 1842. He was considered to be, quote, diligent and thoughtful as a student, something of a critic, and was fond of questions in moral philosophy. He was not a drinker, a smoker, a chewer, or a spitter. He graduated in 1842, 24th in a class of 56 cadets, and was commissioned as a brevet second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery. Brevet, term that means just a temporary rank. So he was a temporary lieutenant. Next slide, please. Doubleday initially served in coastal garrisons and then in the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848. During the Seminole Wars in Florida from 1856 to 1858, his activities involved mapping the Everglades and the areas that would become Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Surprisingly, there's no Abner Doubleday Street in either Miami or Lauderdale. In 1858, he was promoted to captain and was transferred to Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor, serving under Colonel Gardner. He was strongly anti-slavery, became a Republican, and supported Lincoln. He became the lightning rod for Charleston's anger, and the local newspapers loved to hate him. Lieutenant Jefferson C. Davis was second in command at Company E. Jefferson C. Davis had no relationship to Jefferson Davis, who was senator from Mississippi and who would become president of the Confederacy. Jefferson at Company E loathed secession, but was neutral on the topic of slavery. Captain Trumer Seymour commanded Company H, the other company. He was born in Burlington, Vermont, and entered West Point in 1842, and also had served in the Mexican War. Lieutenant James Theodore Talbot was second in command of Company H. He was in his 30s, unmarried, and at the time had active tuberculosis. Next slide, please. This is the Jefferson Davis, who's not related to the Jefferson Davis. He would become an officer in the Union Army when the war started. The next slide, please. And there's a picture of the other commander of the other company, Seymour. Next slide, please. There were 3 engineers at Sumter. Captain John Foster was sent to Fort Moultrie in August of 1860 by the Army Corps of Engineers to improve the fortifications at Moultrie, Sumter, and Pinckney. He needed to hire hundreds of workmen for the work, but found few qualified workmen in Charleston. So he hired 150 workmen from Baltimore who were brought down by ship. First Lieutenant George Snyder was sent to assist Foster in September of 1860. Foster sent him with 100 of the 150 workmen to Fort Sumter to begin to do more work on the fort and mount cannon at the fort. On November 4th, Lincoln won the election despite his name not appearing on the ballot in the Deep South. Next slide, please. Governor Gist urged the legislature of South Carolina to summon a special convention to decide South Carolina's future. He proposed immediately raising an army of 10,000 soldiers, but the legislature was initially reluctant to do this and did not follow his recommendation. A few slides behind you. This is the pictures of all the officers at Sumter. Next slide, please. Here's our governor. And our next slide, please. Now, around the same time, Army headquarters in Washington finally reacted to the possibility of secession. Fitzjohn Porter, an officer in the Adjutant General's office, was ordered to Charleston to analyze the situation and report back. Porter inspected the facilities, interviewed the officers, and reviewed Moultrie's records and left. On November 11th, he handed the Army his scathing report. He considered Moultrie virtually unguarded, and the garrison was too small. He urged the Army to send reinforcements to Fort Moultrie. Next slide, please. Before Porter's report, however, had been submitted, President James Buchanan held a cabinet meeting regarding the fort. He was confident war was not in the offering and was concerned that hot-blooded Carolinians might overreact and start something. Buchanan asked his cabinet if the garrison should move from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter. They considered it at length, and finally Buchanan felt that it might be seen as provocative and therefore must be avoided. Next slide, please. Secretary of War under Buchanan, Floyd, was a Southern sympathizer and issued orders for Fitzjohn Porter to visit West Point and tell Major Robert Anderson, who was teaching at West Point, that he was to be the new commander at Fort Moultrie and should go immediately to Washington. Next slide, please. En route, Porter and Anderson stopped in New York City and visited General Winfield Scott. Scott was the commander of all the armies in the United States at that point. He was a hero of the Mexican War, but at this point he was old and in poor health, was known as Old Fuss and Feathers, and stayed in New York rather than Washington because Washington was too hot, too swampy, and had too many mosquitoes. So he felt better in New York City. Scott was a friend of Anderson, and Scott advised Anderson to not let the possibility of moving the garrison from Moultrie to Sumter, should not let that concept escape him. The next day, Anderson met with Floyd in Washington, who reminded him of the explosive situation in Charleston, and that, quote, no action should be taken that might light a spark, unquote. Orders that were verbal and not written. Anderson arrived at Moultrie on November 19th with the impossible task of strengthening the garrison without riling the civilian population or telling his officers about his orders. Over the next 5 months, he shared little with his officers and was isolated. Next slide, please. Now, why was Anderson chosen? He had been born in a slave state, married the daughter of a famous Georgian politician who had a plantation. He had been previously stationed at Fort Moultrie. He was a friend of Senator Jefferson Davis, who will become the president of the Confederacy, and Senator Crittenden of Kentucky, as well as General Scott. He was a gentle sort, well-mannered, a dutiful husband to a sick wife, a good father, a loyal servant of the Army, and a man of deep-rooted principles. He was a military hero from the Mexican War and a scholar, having taught at West Point for a number of years. He hated politics and he hated politicians and was vaguely sympathetic to the South. His position on slavery was ambivalent and ambiguous. He did oppose secession, but was a man of peace and felt that war solved no problems. Next slide, please. On November 28th, after Anderson had arrived at Fort Moultrie, he wrote a second official report again stating that in South Carolina, people had discovered Moultrie's weaknesses and knew how to attack the fort. He stated that if no reinforcements were to be sent, the best place for his command would be at Fort Sumter. On December 1st, Anderson sent a third report after he met with 2 Charlestonians who informed him that as soon as South Carolina seceded, that is, when their convention met on December 17th, the state would demand the forts in their harbor and would assault them if they had not been handed over. Major Anderson was now between a rock and a hard place. He was under orders from Secretary of War Floyd to take no action that would precipitate a response from the South Carolinians, and at the same time, he was to secure the safety of Fort Moultrie. No reinforcements were to be sent to him, but he was expected to guard Moultrie, Sumter, and Castle Pinckney. He was denied access to the U.S. arsenal in Charleston for muskets and ammunition. He was not to discuss any of his conflicting orders with his officers. He had sent 3 communications to Floyd requesting guidance and had received none. Next slide, please. Secretary Floyd finally did respond to Anderson's December 1st letter. Floyd ordered him to not reduce the height of the sand dunes around Moultrie in the mistaken belief that the dunes were on private property and the sand could not be moved. Floyd, on December 7th, ordered another officer, next slide, please, Major Don Carlos Buell from the Adjutant General's office, to again go to Charleston to review the situation and carry an unwritten, memorized message to Anderson. Next slide. Buell was to remind Anderson to avoid confrontation, but if one occurred, he was told to hold the federal position in the harbor. This implied that Buchanan's administration expected Anderson to do whatever was necessary to maintain the federal presence there. Buell arrived on December 9th and did his inspection the next day. He was convinced Moultrie was too vulnerable, but Sumter was defendable. The next day, before he left, Buell admitted to Anderson, quote, "You ought to have written evidence of these instructions," unquote. He then put Secretary Floyd's orders, his verbal orders, into writing and made 2 copies. He left one with Anderson and took one back with himself to Washington. In the copies were these points. Next slide, please. Reinforcements would not be sent, nor actions taken purposely that might add to the excited state of the public mind. Floyd was confident the South Carolina government could restrain acts of popular violence. But if one of the forts was attacked, or if Anderson had, quote, tangible evidence of a design to proceed to a hostile act, unquote, then and only then could he move the garrison to any of the forts he chose. If he were attacked, Floyd was expected to defend himself to the last extremity. Buell told Anderson, "This is all I am authorized to tell you, but my personal advice is that you not allow the option of moving to Sumter escape you," the same advice that had been given by General Scott. When Buell returned to Washington, he reported to Floyd, and he handed him the copy that he brought with him. Floyd only glanced at it and wrote on it, "This is in conformity to my instructions to Major Buell," and then he signed and dated it. It is not clear if Floyd realized he had just authorized Anderson to move to Sumter. Floyd also showed the note to President Buchanan, whose only comment was to modify the order of fighting to the death. Floyd wrote Anderson that if his garrison were attacked by so superior force that resistance would be futile and loss of life useless, it would be his duty to yield and to make the best surrender terms possible. Such a surrender would be the conduct of an honorable, brave, and humane officer. Anderson was again ordered not to share this with his officers unless absolutely necessary. This communication would be received by Anderson on December 23rd. Now, on the same day that Buell left for Charleston, that December 8th, Buchanan also met with 5 South Carolina congressmen who told him that when their state seceded in a few days, the state would send commissioners to Washington to arrange the transfer of the forts to the state. They also wanted to make certain the status of the forts would not change, that is, the forts would not be destroyed. But Buchanan was not candid with them. He did not tell them that he had no intention of turning over the forts. Buchanan felt that that was not within the executive part of the government, but only Congress could turn the forts over. While speaking to the delegation, he was unaware of the fact that his own government had just sent Don Carlos Buell to Charleston with orders from the Secretary of War. In the meantime, in December, newspapers in Charleston published an article on Fort Sumter that implied the fort in its present condition could easily be taken by a landing party with scaling ladders placed into the open embrasures. On December 17th, the South Carolina Convention met in Columbia, South Carolina. David Jameson was chosen leader of the convention, and in his opening remarks, he said he trusted that their connection with the United States was over. He noted that the North was jealous of the South, had become aggressive, and that every northern state had passed ordinances nullifying the federal fugitive slave laws. Then the convention passed a resolution to convene, to close and move to Charleston because smallpox had been detected in Columbia. On December 20th, they reconvened in Charleston, and without debate, voted for secession. There was frenzied celebration in the city with fireworks, bonfires, parades, cannon salutes, and bell tolling. Next slide, please. Also on December 17th, when the convention was held, Francis Pitkins became the newly elected governor. South Carolina had no political parties, and the legislature chose the governor for a single 2-year term, kind of as a pleasant little honor given to state leaders late in their political careers. Pitkins was jittery as rumors flew. The state legislature authorized the formation of 10 regiments to resist any attempt by the United States government to coerce the state. On December 20th, Pitkins did authorize 2 armed steamboats to steam back and forth between Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter every evening. Next slide, please. Despite the Christmas season, militia units from outside Charleston began arriving in Charleston, and Anderson received reports that scaling ladders were being prepared. The major spent Christmas evening attending a party at the Fosters. He did not mention that he had decided on a bold stroke. He was going to move the garrison from Moultrie to Sumter in small boats. He knew from 2 newspapers that the secession commissioners were departing for Washington to demand that the forts be turned over to South Carolina. He guessed that Buchanan would not receive them on Christmas Day, December 25th, but they would meet with the president on December 26th. Anderson suspected Buchanan would not agree to their wishes. The commissioners would then telegraph the president's reply on the 27th back to Charleston. Therefore, Anderson concluded he would have to make his move on Christmas night, hoping that the spies and the 2 patrol boats would be less vigilant then. A full moon would provide some light. He told no one of his plans, but he needed a trick to, in a sense, allow him to do things that the spies would not detect as leading up to an event. There were about 24 wives and families of men living at Moultrie. He could not leave them at Moultrie, but likewise, they could not be expected to be ready quickly or to keep children quiet in an open boat in the harbor. He announced that he wanted to put the families out of harm's way and to house them temporarily in the empty structures at Fort Johnson. The enlisted men's families had been ordered to pack their belongings along with a large amount of commissary stores. They and the supplies would be shipped on 3 large schooners to Fort Johnson, perhaps on Christmas Day. The commanders of the schooners would be Southerners from Charleston. Local spies, of course, learned of the coming transfer, but they remained unconcerned because the removal of families was not perceived as a threat and seemed quite appropriate. Anderson also worried that once he abandoned Fort Moultrie, there would be a period of time that his men would be vulnerable in the boats and unloading supplies at Sumter. He decided to spike the cannon at Moultrie and to burn the wooden gun carriages. December 25th dawned with nasty weather, and Anderson decided to postpone for 24 hours, still informing no one of his plan. On the 26th, it was 40 degrees, foggy, with a misty rain, and Anderson hoped the weather would improve slightly, and he had to make his move on that day. He told some of his staff that he wanted to relocate the families that day. He told only Captain Foster about the real mission. In the early afternoon, the families were placed on board the 3 schooners, and at 3 p.m., Anderson told Lieutenant Hall, one of his officers, the secret plan. Hall was to take the 3 schooners to Fort Johnson, but keep everyone on board on the excuse that he had to determine the best place to land them. When he heard 2 signal guns fired from Fort Moultrie, he was to reboard the schooners, and the 3 schooners were to head for Sumter. Hall was to tell the Southern captains in the boats that he did not find acceptable accommodations at Sumter, so at Fort Johnson, so he was taking the children and the wives and the supplies to Sumter. Sunset would be shortly after 5 p.m. and moonrise at 5:42. Anderson used 3 six-oared barges for the transfer of his garrison. Messages had been sent to Lieutenant Meade at Castle Pinckney and Lieutenant Snyder at Fort Sumter to come with their boats to Fort Moultrie that afternoon. Around 5 p.m., Anderson informed Captain Doubleday of the move to Sumter. Doubleday was to have Company E ready to move in 20 minutes. The officers' wives were not included in the move to Sumter and were to be left behind at Moultrie. They were to spend the evening at the home of the chaplain and his wife and then arrange their own transportation back north. That same message went to Company H and the rest of the command. Next slide, please. Anderson's plan was for the garrison to cross in 2 waves. He, Doubleday, and Company E would go in the first wave. The trip to and from Sumter would take about an hour. The boats would return for Company H and the band members. Lieutenant Jeff Davis would remain at Moultrie to load and man the cannon that pointed toward Sumter. He was to fire on any patrol boat that interfered with the crossing. Captain Foster, the engineer, would remain with the rear guard to spike the guns and burn the carriages of the cannon facing Sumter. When the boats finally returned for the rear guard, they were to grab as much ammunition as they could, plus any other artillery paraphernalia. The sea was calm, and as Doubleday's boat got in the middle of the channel, one of the steam-powered patrol boats appeared. The men took off their coats and threw them over their muskets to hide the polished surfaces that might reflect moonlight. The patrol boat stopped about 100 yards off and then slowly moved away, apparently satisfied. When the 3 boats landed at Sumter, some of the workmen who lived at Sumter during the repairs cheered, while others who were Southern sympathizers were openly hostile. The soldiers quickly restored order with bayonets. Next slide, please. As the second wave left Moultrie, another steamer appeared. The rear guard prepared to fire their cannon, but the steamer passed oblivious to the boats in the channel. Moultrie then fired the 2 signal guns, and Lieutenant Hall headed for Sumter with the families and the provisions. They arrived just before 8 p.m. Next slide, please. Much still needed to be done. About 100 of the workmen could not be trusted. They were paid and were taken to Charleston the next day on the 3 schooners. 55 were trusted and were asked to stay. 1 barracks was designated for women and children, and the bunks were made using wood shavings as bedding. The morning would reveal that the fort had glaring weaknesses. Although 15 cannon had been mounted, all of them pointed out to the Atlantic Ocean and were long-range guns. The guns could not prevent an assault on the esplanade or the gorge wall. The embrasures on the first tier were chest-high and were covered with simple wooden shutters that could be knocked aside by a hammer. The embrasures on the second tier were 8 by 8 foot openings and could easily be accessed by troops with scaling ladders. Residents in Charleston heard the signal guns, but mistakenly assumed that they meant that Governor Pitkins had approved the militia takeover of Fort Sumter. The signal meant that Sumter was safely theirs. Just after dawn on the 27th, smoke was noted over Sullivan Island, and the astonishing news arrived in Charleston that Anderson had skipped over to Sumter and that Moultrie was burning. The leaders of South Carolina were apoplectic. It was one thing for their state to secede from the United States, but it was completely unacceptable for Anderson to secede from South Carolina. A delegation of 2 officers was sent to meet with Anderson. The delegation claimed an agreement existed between Buchanan and former Governor Gist that the forts would be turned over to South Carolina. Anderson said he knew of no such agreement. Militia had been preparing to attack Moultrie, he argued, and so he moved to Sumter to avoid bloodshed. The delegation stated the governor wanted Anderson to return to Moultrie, and they tried the Pitkins move. Anderson respectfully declined and sent a message to Pitkins. When the delegation returned to Charleston, Pitkins then ordered the militia to seize both Castle Pinckney and Moultrie. By moving against Pinckney, Pitkins was committing an act of military aggression against the United States, thus making the prospect of peace unlikely. The governor and the local press argued that Anderson had started it, and that Pinckney actually belonged to South Carolina and was simply loaned to the United States, and that, quote, spiking the guns and burning of carriages was as much an act of war as loading and firing the guns, unquote. At 4:30 p.m., 3 militia companies landed at Pinckney. Lieutenant Meade, who was there with the ordnance sergeant and his family, had not received the earlier order to report to Moultrie. The ordnance sergeant and his family and 30 workmen had occupied the fort. Several of the militia scaled the wall, opened the gates, and entered the fort. Meade refused to recognize the authority of the governor, but offered no resistance. The American flag was pulled down, and it was replaced by a red flag with a single white star on it. Meade was allowed to go to Sumter. A second group of 200 militia sailed to Moultrie, arriving there about 8 p.m. All was quiet, and the gates were closed. 2 men scaled the wall, unlocked the gates, and the militia entered the fort. That group had a flag with a palmetto on it. Next slide, please. After the delegation had left Sumter, Anderson ordered everyone to gather on the parade ground at Sumter. He had something in mind. After the American Revolution, each ex-colony adopted its own state flag as it declared statehood. To most Americans, the flag was merely one more symbol of their country along with the eagle. The Army Artillery Branch became the first branch to use the official United States flag in 1834, mostly because they manned seaport fortifications. The infantry began carrying the American flag in 1841. The cavalry did not officially begin to carry the country's flag until 1895. Now think back to all those westerns that you saw as kids where the cavalry was racing to save the wagon train from attacking Indians. And of course, next to the bugler was a soldier carrying the American flag. All wrong. That would not be until 1895 that the cavalry would carry the American flag. Until Robert Anderson altered history on December 27th, the symbol most used by the U.S. Army was the coat of arms, the eagle, the shield, the olive branch, and the arrows. Anderson had read the hot-blooded speeches of South Carolina's politicians. He felt desperately isolated, unlike the rage that consumed Abner Doubleday. Anderson felt primarily sadness. His hatred of war and his orders from Washington made him suppress his private rage. Anderson had served his entire adult life under the flag and understood that the Army emphasized that the flag's honor had to be defended. Next slide, please. Each coastal fortification had 2 American flags. A garrison flag was huge, 20 by 36 feet, and was meant to be seen from great distances. A large flag had to be made of a light material because of its size, and silk was the preferred material. That could easily tear in high winds. Thus, each garrison also had a smaller storm flag, which measured 10 by 20 feet, that they would fly in foul weather. It was noon when Anderson raised the American flag over Fort Sumter. Next slide, please. The soldiers were on the parade ground along with the workmen and the women and children. Anderson stood by the flagstaff with the flag draped over his hands, over the hands of a sergeant. Reverend Harris was present, having just arrived from Moultrie by boat. Major Anderson took off his hat, knelt on the ground, and bowed his head. Others knelt, and Reverend Harris thanked the Lord. The garrison had made it safely across. He prayed that the flag that they were preparing to raise would soon float over a united nation that would remain prosperous and at peace. He asked God that this flag never be dishonored. Anderson then rose to his feet, and the huge garrison flag rose over in the air as the band members on the rampart played the Star-Spangled Banner. The men shouted great huzzahs. Anderson's simple, normal act of raising the flag was depicted in Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's illustrated newspapers a couple weeks later. By then, Sumter had stopped being one of dozens of forts in seceded states. Sumter had been important for several weeks, but now it became an emotional magnet and deeply stirred national patriotism. Anderson's transfer to Sumter, then his raising of the flag above it, tied the hands first of Buchanan and then later Lincoln. December 28th was fair, but it started to rain on the 29th and became nasty on the 30th. The next day, 1860 passed into the history books. Next slide, please. Louis Trevant Wigfall was a new senator from Texas and had already become the nation's spokesman for a Southern Confederacy. On the 27th, he brought the stunning news of Anderson's actions to Secretary Floyd in Washington. A group immediately went to see President Buchanan to demand that he order Anderson to return to Moultrie. But Buchanan wanted to hear from Anderson first, and he wanted to meet with his cabinet. At the meeting, Floyd railed against Anderson's decision. The new Secretary of State, and he was a new Secretary of State because the members of Buchanan's cabinet who were Southern sympathizers, all of them resigned except Floyd. So Black was appointed as the new Secretary of State. Jeremiah Black reminded everyone that Floyd himself had given Anderson the right to move to Sumter. Buell's letter with Floyd's signature on it was pulled up and reviewed. Floyd finally resigned later that day. Buchanan then let Black, his Secretary of State, write his response to the request that Anderson move back to Moultrie. The official response was, quote, "This I cannot do, this I will not do," unquote. That was sent on December 31st. General Winfield Scott met with Buchanan and urged reinforcements for Anderson. A plan was devised to move soldiers from New York City on a civilian ship because the channel at Charleston Harbor was too shallow for warships. In Charleston, Governor Pickens in South Carolina were really not ready for war. He first ordered the federal arsenal seized. Within a week, the cadets from the Citadel had a battery set up on Morris Island. In the North, Anderson was hailed as a hero. In a message, he indicated that his position was steadily improving, but that gun batteries were being erected in the harbor that would make resupply of Sumter dangerous. In early January, General Scott leased a private merchant ship, the Star of the West. Next slide, please. It was loaded with supplies and 200 soldiers and left New York on January 5th with great secrecy. On the 6th, the next day in Charleston, there were reports about the ship as well as an article in the New York Times. So much for government secrecy that Charleston knew the next day that the ship was en route. Governor Pickens ordered his soldiers to fire on the vessel if sighted. On the morning of January 9th, the Star of the West was at Charleston Harbor ready to enter. The Star was spotted by the battery on Morris Island that was manned by the cadets from the Citadel. Technically, one of the young officers there fired the first gun of the Civil War, but war had not yet been declared, and this was just the state of South Carolina firing at a merchant ship. The Star ran up its huge American flag, hoping Anderson would see it and begin the fire at the military battery. Fort Moultrie joined in with the cadets with a few ineffective shots, and then the Star of the West turned and retreated out to sea and eventually back to New York. At Sumter, Doubleday saw the Star with its flag. Cannon facing Morris Island and Moultrie were loaded and made ready to fire, but Anderson hesitated. He could see that the militia fire was ineffective, and he was still under orders not to provoke a fight. Then the Star turned, and Anderson said to Doubleday, "Hold on, do not fire, I will wait." For the first time, Anderson then told his officers of his orders to not precipitate an event. Anderson had not heard from Washington that an attempt was being made to reinforce him. He also felt that Sumter was not yet ready for war, and he did not want to be responsible for starting a war. Next slide, please. Governor Pickens delivered an ultimatum to Anderson to leave Sumter, which implied that an attack was imminent. By now, Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama had seceded. Even though Anderson had already sent Lieutenant Talbot to Washington with a message, Anderson suggested to the Pickens staff that One of them and Lieutenant Hall carried the ultimatum itself to Washington for an answer. This would avoid immediate bloodshed. Both sides realized that a delay would allow both sides to prepare. When Talbot arrived in Washington, he delivered a first-person account of events to President Buchanan. For Buchanan, things were now falling apart. Next slide, please. Most disturbing, however, events occurring, the most disturbing were events in Pensacola, Florida. Fort Pickens, not related at all to Governor Pickens, contained 210 cannon to protect the large naval base there. Fort Pickens was actually larger than Sumter and could house 1,200 men, but only 47 men of Company G, the United States 1st Artillery, under Lieutenant Adam Schlemmer, were stationed near the forts there. Next slide, please. On January 8th, Schlemmer received a dispatch from General Scott to do his utmost to prevent the forts in Pensacola from being seized. Schlemmer, like Anderson, moved his command to a more defensible position. Buchanan ordered the Army and the Navy to send the fleet and hundreds of soldiers to reinforce Schlemmer. Fort Pickens was at the mouth of the harbor and could easily be resupplied from the sea, whereas Sumter ships had to enter the harbor to supply it. Lieutenant Talbot returned to Sumter with messages. The new Secretary of War, Holt, apologized that Anderson did not know of the attempt to reinforce him with the Star of the West. Holt called the move to Sumter brilliant. Holt also said that since the garrison at the moment was safe, there would be no further reinforcements, since to do so would lead to war. A week later, in early February, there was an official rejection of Pickens' request or order or ultimatum. On the 6th, Governor Pickens ordered a 48-hour bombardment of Sumter. Again, his military commanders indicated their guns were not all ready and they had only limited ammunition. Moreover, Jefferson Davis was now urging him to let the new Confederacy take over the problem of Sumter. On February 9th in Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederacy elected Jefferson Davis as its first president and passed a resolution claiming sovereignty over the questions involving Fort Sumter. Next slide, please. A Southern artillery expert, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, was appointed the first brigadier general in the Confederate Army and was ordered to Charleston. Next slide, please. On February 23rd, Lincoln arrived from Springfield, arrived in Washington. Since his election, he had repeatedly indicated that he would not attempt to eliminate slavery in the existing states that still had slavery. However, he would not allow slavery in any new states. The inauguration was March 4th, and after Lincoln's speech, Senator Wigfall wired Charleston, quote, "Inaugural means war," unquote. Anderson had begun to realize that a peaceful solution was waning and that the seceded states were not going to return to the Union. He stated the garrison was now beginning to run out of provisions and put his men on half rations. The workmen's families and the rest of the workmen were taken to Charleston and allowed to return home. Lincoln had discovered that his treasury was empty, his army demoralized, and his civil service riddled with treason and uncertainty. General Scott said, quote, "I now see no other alternative but a surrender." Lincoln was concerned about Fort Pickens in Pensacola also. He did not want to lose two forts, so he told Scott to make certain that Fort Pickens was reinforced. Next slide, please. Lincoln's first cabinet meeting was March 9th, and he informed the cabinet of Sumter's need to be evacuated. Within a day, Charleston newspapers had announced that Sumter would be evacuated. The source of their story was, quote, "a top Republican senator," probably Seward. So again, from the cabinet meeting to Charleston in one day, faster than the U.S. mail can move letters today to Charleston. The source of the garrison got the same news from the local newspapers. but Anderson received no official orders or report. By March 18th, nothing had changed, and now both sides were becoming anxious. Lincoln had not been entirely convinced of the need to evacuate. In his cabinet, Simon Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, felt that sending food to Sumter would not lead to war. Montgomery Blair, his postal secretary, felt that not sending provisions would convince the Confederacy that Washington had no backbone, and this would lead to war. Kind of an interesting counterpoint there. Lincoln decided to send several emissaries to Charleston to scout out the ground and get more information. Next slide, please. Gustavus Vasa Fox had graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1841 and had spent 15 years at sea before retiring. After the Star of the West disaster, he began developing a plan to reinforce Sumter using fast shallow draft steam tugs to bring supplies in from a powerful fleet outside the harbor. Fox was invited to Lincoln's cabinet meeting on March 13th. He was then sent to Charleston to deliver official messages to Anderson on March 19th. Governor Pickens granted Fox permission to visit Sumter. Anderson gave Fox a tour of the fort, explaining all the reasons why an expedition to reinforce him would be hopeless because of the Confederate guns. Nonetheless, Fox was convinced his plan would work. The second emissary was Stephen Hobart, a former 30-year resident of Charleston and a Lincoln friend. He arrived in the city on March 25th. He was convinced that a ship with only provisions would be stopped. Next slide, please. The third emissary was Ward Hill Lamon. He met with Governor Pickens, and the two of them got along famously. Both were somewhat braggarts. Pitkin warned that any attempt to provision Sumter would result in war. Lamon was allowed to visit Anderson and indicated quite clearly that the fort was going to be evacuated. Lamon then returned to Pickens, who agreed to the use of a civilian steamship to pick up the garrison. Lamon said he would be back in a few days to make the final arrangements. He even wrote a letter to Pickens after Lamon had returned to Washington, confirming their conversations. However, Lamon had absolutely no authority to make such a promise. On March 30th, still no orders had arrived for Anderson. Lincoln arrived at a new conclusion. If he had a relief expedition ready, he would have the option of using it. Although he never admitted it, Lincoln may have concluded that war was inevitable and it would be far better for the Confederacy to fire the first shot. Jefferson Davis was thinking the same thing at Pensacola, where he sent the second appointed Confederate general, General Braxton Bragg, to command forces there. Lincoln now took Fox's list of requirements to the Secretary of Navy and his new Secretary of War with direction to have everything ready for April 6th in case he wanted to proceed with Fox's plan. Next slide, please. April 4th was a busy day. Senator Wigfall left Washington for Charleston, where he would join General Buford's staff. Lincoln received Anderson's letter of April 1st, and it pushed him to action. A flurry of messages went out from Washington. A relief force was being launched, and the president hoped Anderson could hold out until April 12th. Provisions were to be sent, but if South Carolina attempted to stop it, reinforcements would also try to land. If Anderson felt he could not hold out, he was authorized to surrender. At the fort, Anderson began preparations, and each man's provisions were reduced further to 2 crackers a day and a piece of salt pork. Jefferson Davis on April 8th ordered Pickens to prevent supplies from reaching Sumter. Early on the 10th, Davis wired General Beauregard to immediately demand Sumter's evacuation, and if refused, proceed to reduce it. Beauregard replied he would present the ultimatum at noon on April 11th. He wanted to delay a day because a new, highly accurate Blakely cannon had arrived from London and was being put in position. On the night of the 10th, also, a valuable supply of gunpowder was arriving from Georgia and needed to be parceled out. Next slide, please. At 3:45 on April 11th, 3 men, led by James Chestnut, the husband of Mary Chestnut, Alexander Chisholm, and Stephen Dill Lee, rode to Sumter to talk to Anderson. Beauregard had promised transportation of the men and their belongings and their flag to any Union port. Anderson and his officers rejected the offer. As the three were leaving, Anderson asked, quote, "Will General Beauregard open his batteries without further notice to me?" Chestnut replied, "No, I can say to you that he will not without giving you further notice." As at the boat, Anderson then said, "Gentlemen, if you do not batter the fort into pieces about us, we shall be starved out in a few days," unquote. When this was reported to Beauregard, he wired Montgomery for instructions. If Anderson would promise to not use his guns unless fired upon, and if he would state exactly when he would leave the fort, it would not be necessary to bombard Sumter. This message was carried by the same three aides to Anderson late at night. At 1:30 a.m. on April 12th, Anderson read the message and consulted with his officers. The unacceptable phrase was "unless fired upon." If Fox's fleet arrived and started into the harbor and the Confederates fired upon the fleet, Anderson and his men agreed that they would fire upon the Confederates. They stated they would leave the fort at noon on April 15th, assuming they had not been fired upon and that no new orders had been received from Washington. This was presented to Beauregard's aides at 3:20 a.m. Although Anderson's reply did not exactly reject Beauregard's offer, it did not clearly accept them. James Chestnut, following Beauregard's expressed wishes, said that the shore batteries would open fire in 1 hour. Anderson shook each aide's hand and returned to the fort. He told his men to expect the attack within the hour. He urged them to try and get some sleep. He reminded everyone they would not return fire until dawn. He ordered the smaller American storm flag to be raised. Next slide, please. Captain George James commanded a mortar battery on James Island. The two mortars on the beach near Fort Johnson were commanded by Lieutenant Henry Farley. At 4:30 a.m., he pulled the lanyard. The first shell exploded over Sumter. Beauregard had ordered the 43 guns to fire in a counterclockwise fashion around the harbor at 2-minute intervals. He wanted to conserve ammunition, for he had only enough ammunition for a 48-hour bombardment. Next slide, please. Edmund Ruffin, the Virginia fire eater, had come to Charleston on the 9th and had stayed with the Palmetto Guard at Cummings Point. He was given the honor of firing a 64-pound shell from the large Columbiad cannon there. For years, he believed, and historians reported and books reported, that he fired the first shot from the Confederacy. Next slide, please. Likewise, the residents of Charleston, including Mary Chestnut herself, had expected the bombardment to begin on the 11th, but had gone to bed disappointed. After the first shell, they raced the rooftops in the battery area of the city to watch the bombardment. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the first telegram from Charleston arrived at Montgomery, Alabama. Quote, "The deed is done." Next slide, please. At Sumter, there was no return fire. There were no candles to provide light in the casements to see the cannon, let alone load them. Their supply of candles that they brought over from Moultrie had run out. It was just too dark to load the cannon. So they delayed until about 7 o'clock in the morning when there was enough light to fire. At 6:30, Doubleday's crew pulled back the heavy shutters from 4 of the embrasures facing the floating iron battery on Cummings Point. Doubleday sighted the cannon and ordered it fired. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is the centennial stamp issued in 1961 on the 100th anniversary of the start of the Civil War. I like to believe that it depicts Doubleday sighting the cannon. The post office made no official comment about this, but I believe the image represents Doubleday sighting the cannon. Notice he's sighting the cannon by eye. Uh, his first shot was high, and he had to readjust and fire again. And his sixth shot struck the slanted roof of the iron battery and glanced off harmlessly. Remember, when they evacuated Moultrie, Company H, when the rowboats went back to pick up the rear guard, they were to gather as much ammunition and artillery paraphernalia as possible to bring over. Well, among the paraphernalia that they forgot to bring was the sextant for sighting the angle of a cannon. Sumter had only to rely on the visual sighting to do this. That's why I believe this is Doubleday sighting the cannon. The most serious deficiency for Doubleday, however, was a shortage of cartridge bags. The garrison had plenty of gunpowder, but only 500 bags. There was little cloth at Sumter and only 6 large sewing needles. By the time of the start of the bombardment, they had made an additional 200 bags, even using socks to hold the powder. Next slide, please. The 3 interior buildings at Sumter were made mostly of wood, and after the tile roofs were destroyed, fires began. These were put out several times by the garrison, but then the Confederates began firing hot shot, which restarted the fires. Next slide, please. At 1 p.m., a lookout at Sumter sighted the arrival of some of the ships of Fox's fleet. Anderson signaled that he was still holding out, but the fleet had its own problems. A storm along the coast had tossed the fleet about and scattered it. The revenue cutter Harriet Lane had actually arrived on the 11th, and around 3 a.m. in the morning of the 12th, the unarmed steamer Baltic had arrived, and just after dawn, the warship Pawnee had arrived. The 3 steam tugs were nowhere in sight, however. Fox decided to wait until more ships arrived. If they had not arrived by the next morning, they were going to use rowboats instead of the steam tugs to bring in the provisions. At 7 p.m. that night, Anderson instructed his batteries to cease firing until morning. Beauregard's batteries also ceased firing, except 2 batteries of mortars that fired every quarter hour just to harass the men at Sumter. America outside of South Carolina was gradually learning of the attack on Sumter. Next slide, please. Oh, we are at the next slide. Okay. At Pensacola on the evening of the 12th, Captain Adams, commanding the fleet there, bringing reinforcements and provisions to save Fort Pickens, and Lieutenant Slemmer arrived. Lieutenant Worden, returning from Washington, had arrived hours before the knowledge of the Sumter attack was known by the Confederate forces there. Had Worden not been delayed by the same storm that scattered the fleet, he might have arrived a day earlier. Captain Adams would have deposited his reinforcements on the 11th, and General Bragg may have decided to attack Fort Pickens on the 11th. Thus, just by the chance of this storm that both scattered Fox's fleet and delayed by 1 day the supplies arriving at Pensacola. If that had not occurred, the Civil War would have started in Pensacola, Florida, and not at Charleston, because Bragg would have attacked first. On the 13th, the second day of the bombardment, things began slowly. Next slide, please. At 7:30 a.m., a mortar shell exploded in the officers' quarters and started a brisk fire. By 8 a.m., giant clouds of smoke billowed from Sumter. This is the sesquicentennial stamp issued by the post office, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War in 2015, and it's based on a Currier and Ives print showing Fort Sumter with the fires burning on it. Notice in every artistic representation of the firing at Sumter, you see Sumter in the distance, and you see the contrails of shells coming in. Again, another embellishment by artists, because Beauregard had ordered the firing at 2-minute intervals. So every 2 minutes, a shell would come in, not not multiple shells simultaneously. The fires also threatened the powder magazine, where 300 barrels of gunpowder were stored. Some of the barrels were removed, and then the heavy copper doors of the magazine were closed. A chance shot from a Confederate cannon then hit the doors and bent them so that they could no longer be opened. At 1 p.m., the flagstaff fell, which began a series of events that would end all this. Next slide, please. When a shell hit the 10-story flagstaff, the pole fell like a huge pine tree. The Confederate gunners and crowd cheers. In a span of 15 minutes, amid bursting shells and thick smoke, Lieutenants Seymour and Snyder retrieved the flag. One of the soldiers, Peter Hart, found a spar which was carried up to the parapet. Hart nailed the flag to the spar, and the spar was nailed to a gun carriage. Again, the artistic representation of Hart climbing up the flag amid the shells flying, the flagpole, and carrying the flag up with him and nailing the flag to the flagpole up there. He nailed it to the flag on the ground, and they raised the flag. When the flag fell, a group of Beauregard's aides at Cummings Point conferred and agreed a boat should go to Sumter immediately. Our friend Louis Trevant Wigfall commandeered a rowboat and a soldier and had the soldier row him out to Sumter. He failed to hear the shouts that the flag had gone up again. By the time he landed at the fort, the shelling had resumed, so he climbed through one of the embrasures and announced to the surprised soldiers there that he wanted to speak to Major Anderson. Meantime, a vessel carrying the official messengers from Beauregard had left Charleston, but had stopped halfway there when the flag had gone up again. They were to offer assistance to the garrison to put out the fires, but were not to make any other offer of peace. At Sumter, Wigfall said to the soldiers, "You are on fire and your flag is down. Let us quit." But Anderson's officers showed Wigfall the restored flag, and he realized that the garrison had not been defeated and his whole mission, which had been based on a misconception. At this point, Anderson appeared. Wigfall said, "General Beauregard wishes to stop this," unquote. Anderson knew that he had just 4 small barrels of gunpowder left and 3 cartridge bags left. Fox's fleet had not moved. There was no food left. They were whipped, but now there was a messenger from Beauregard offering a truce, not demanding a surrender. Anderson understood the remarkable implications of this. A truce meant that he and his garrison had not been defeated. Wigfall: "You have defended your flag nobly, sir. You have done all that is possible to do, and General Beauregard wants to stop this fight. On what terms, Major Anderson, will you evacuate this fort?" Anderson: "General Beauregard is already acquainted with my only terms." These had been the ones given to James Chestnut 2 days before, namely that they salute their flag as they lowered it, and that they leave with their belongings and property, and that they be supplied transportation north. On these conditions only, the fort would belong to the Confederacy. Wigfall left, and he left the white flag that he had brought with him, and that was raised over Sumter and the American flag taken down. The real messengers from Beauregard were now more confused and resumed their trip to Sumter. The shelling ceased. The crowds again broke out with cheering. Wigfall had his soldier row him to Charleston and rushed off to tell Beauregard. Meantime, the real messengers arrived at Sumter and met with Anderson, and things quickly got complicated. Anderson told them of his agreement with Wigfall. The messengers replied Wigfall had not seen Beauregard in the past 2 days and was not advised on any conditions. Anderson, at this, was furious and embarrassed, and now threatened to raise his flag again and start firing. The aides were stunned. While they were talking, 2 more aides arrived from Beauregard to offer terms that were similar to what had been discussed 2 days earlier, except Anderson would not be permitted to salute the flag. Anderson showed the new aides what Wigfall had promised. All 5 aides now were confused and left to report to Beauregard. But an hour later, one returned with word that Beauregard cheerfully agreed to the salute to the flag. Thus ended the second day of the Civil War. Miraculously, no one had been killed on either side, despite the 1,000 rounds that fired by Sumter at the Confederate cannon and the more than 3,300 shells fired at Fort Sumter. There were reports that one Confederate horse was killed by a shell, but that was not confirmed. Later that morning, Fox was informed that Anderson was evacuating the fort. One of the civilian steamers was allowed to come in and dock near Sumter to load the personal belongings of the soldiers. It was not until 2:30 p.m. that the salute to the flag was started. It was to be a 100-gun salute. The garrison soldiers had been making more cartridge bags for this. Just before the count reached 50, there was an explosion when one of the guns accidentally fired prematurely. Private Daniel Hough, Hough, was ramming a cartridge bag into the muzzle when it exploded, ripping off his right arm at the shoulder and killing him instantly. He was the first casualty of the Civil War. When the cannon fired prematurely, some sparks ignited a pile of cartridge bags nearby, exploding them and injuring the rest of the gun crew. Two of the members of the gun crew were so severely wounded that they were taken to Charleston Hospital, where one of them died as the second casualty of the Civil War. The salute to the flag was stopped at that point. The rest of the garrison left with their flag still nailed to the temporary flagstaff. Their band played Yankee Doodle. It was about 4:30 p.m. Low tide was now occurring, and now the steamer was stuck on the shoal there and would have to stay there overnight until the 15th. Now, next slide, please. And the next slide. The aftermath of all this, the Confederates got into the fort. This is the first picture taken. You can see the burned-out roof of the buildings, but some of the cannon on the parapet. But the fort was pretty much intact. Next slide, please. On arrival in New York City, a massive crowd of 250,000 people greeted the men as heroes. The men of Company E and H would spend a few weeks with their family, and they were sent then off to the new war. All were given a medallion depicting this. All 10 of the garrison's officers would be dead or medically retired by 1874. None would die in battle. Charleston held out till the end of the war. Next slide, please. But Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Fox was made Assistant Secretary of the Navy, obsessed over this. Repeated attacks were made against Sumter, battering it to rubble, firing over 50,000 shells against her. With Sherman's invasion of South Carolina, Charleston fell on February 17, 1865. This is why if you visit Fort Sumter today, it's just a one-level fort. In World War I, a coastal gun would be mounted at Fort Sumter for defense against a German fleet that never materialized. In World War II, it became a aircraft observation station. If you go there today, you'll see the base of the cannon that were placed there in World War I. But and a few of the casements are still intact that you can tour. Next slide, please. Anderson was made a brigadier general, but in 1863 resigned because of reasons of health. In 1865, Secretary of War Stanton asked him to perform one last symbolic service. The fort had officially fallen on April 14, 1861. Stanton wanted General Anderson to raise the same flag on April 14, 1865. Stanton invited numerous prominent dignitaries. Next slide, please. The ceremony opened with a prayer by the same Chaplain Harris, who prayed on the December 27th, 1861 flag raising at Sumter. Anderson held a scorched and ripped flag in his hands and said, quote, "After 4 long, long years of war, I restore to its proper place this dear flag," unquote. He prayed that all nations one day should proclaim glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill to men, unquote. The band played the Star Spangled Banner, and on the closing lines, many people wept and hugged each other. That night at a banquet, Anderson proposed a toast, quote, "To the health of another man we all love to honor, the man who, when elected President of the United States, was compelled to reach the seat of government without an escort, but a man who now could travel all over the country with millions of hands and hearts to sustain him. I give you the good, the great, the honest man, Abraham Lincoln," unquote. It was a few minutes after 10 p.m., almost at the precise moment that John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger of his Derringer at the head of the president. Next slide, please. But what? Oh, this is where Major Anderson is buried, at West Point. Next slide, please. Next slide. Well, that was the end of the beginning, but what happened to Doubleday? Well, next slide, please. Doubleday was promoted to a major on May 14th, 1861, and commanded the artillery department of the Shenandoah Valley. He was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers on February 3rd, 1862, and was assigned to duty in Northern Virginia while the Army of the Potomac conducted the Peninsula Campaign. His first combat assignment was to lead the 2nd Brigade, 1st Division, 3rd Corps in the Army of Virginia, commanded by General Pope. Next slide, please. In the actions at Brawner Farm, just before the Second Battle of Manassas, or Second Bull Run, Doubleday took the initiative to send 2 of his regiments to reinforce General John Gibbon's brigade against the much larger Confederate force, fighting it to a standstill. Gibbon's brigade, who become known as the Iron Brigade, all of that in the Midwest. So that's Indiana, Wisconsin. Doubleday stands in the 76th New York and 56th Pennsylvania to reinforce the line. These men in this battle, this is the first major engagement for Gibbon's force, at a range of 50 yards, fired at each other for about 2 hours. That's that's unbelievable. That both sides faced that, and the Iron Brigade became known as the Iron Brigade because of their stand at Brawner Farm. Doubleday had taken the initiative to send his troops in because his division commander, General King, had been incapacitated by an epileptic seizure. Doubleday again led the same division, now reassigned to the Army of the Potomac at South Mountain and at Antietam. And he again was in command because King had been wounded. His division commander had been wounded and was not available. So twice Doubleday is thrust into command of the division because of their commander being removed. He fought in the cornfield in the West Woods at Antietam, and one colonel described him as a gallant officer, remarkably cool at the very front of battle. He was wounded by an artillery shell that exploded near him, killing his horse. And after Antietam, he was promoted to brevet lieutenant colonel in the regular army, and was made a major general of volunteers in the volunteer army, assumed command of the 3rd Division. At the Battle of Gettysburg, next slide, please. 1st Corps was commanded by Major General John Reynolds and was the first infantry to arrive on the battlefield to relieve General Buford's cavalry, which had been holding back the Confederate advance from the west into Gettysburg. That 1st Division included the Iron Brigade, which performed admirably. Oh, next slide, please. This is Doubleday's statue at Gettysburg. So first Corps comes up. 1st Division comes up. 1st Division with Reynolds holding back the Easy Village. The Iron Brigade holds on well at the ridge line there, but the 2nd Brigade is flanked on both sides by the Confederates, and starts to retreat. Doubleday had ridden forward. Second and third divisions were coming up the Emmitsburg Pike. Doubleday took his staff and rode forward to find out what was happening. And about the time he arrives on the battlefield, Reynolds, the corps commander, is killed by a Confederate sharpshooter. So command again devolves down to Abner Doubleday, just like at Antietam, just like at Broader Farm. Also riding up about the same time is General Oliver Howard, who is the commander of the 11th Corps. Howard will assume command of the entire field when his forces get there. Howard sees two regiments of the 1st Corps in retreat, and he assumes that 1st Corps has collapsed, or Doubleday. He also knows of Reynolds' death, and he feels that Doubleday has lost control of the situation, and the entire defense is collapsing. Howard sends a message back to General Meade at headquarters, indicating that 1st Corps has collapsed under Doubleday, and he will try and save the day. Doubleday knew that Reynolds had chosen this position, and Doubleday, when he arrived on the field, found out he was in command, was determined to hold that position. His 2nd and 3rd division were just coming on the battlefield, so he reorganizes his 1st division. He pulls the Iron Brigade back to a new position. He brings up artillery. When the 2nd and 3rd divisions arrive, he forms a defense in depth to protect McPherson Ridge and Seminary Ridge. As the day wears on, his men are being flanked. 11th Corps finally comes up on the field. Howard is supposed to link up with Doubleday in the northern division of Cemetery Hill. He has two up here, but Barlow takes one of them forward as a salient, leaving a gap in the line between the 11th and 1st Corps, and the Confederates take advantage of that gap and begin to flank 1st Corps. So Doubleday starts a fighting retreat back to Seminary Ridge first, and then they're back to their final position on Cemetery Hill. Instead of crumbling under the pressure of the situation, Doubleday rose to the occasion and assumed command with a toughness and confidence that defied the opinions of his peers and commanding general. Doubleday did not inspire confidence in his fellow officers. He was not inspiring looking. He was somewhat portly and tall and had a ruffled look, but he was an experienced officer. And although he had performed credibly at 2nd Manassas and at Antietam, his star had never really shone brightly. Part of this may have been due to the fact that he also had a somewhat quarrelsome personality and a sensitive pride that was easily offended. But he held a day and retreated, facing basically 1/3 of the Confederate army. By 2 p.m. of that day, after he had been pushed off of McPherson Ridge, a total of 12 brigades, numbering 20,000 men, supported by 75 guns. That was the Confederate force facing him, with his 8,000 men and 28 guns. When the Seminary Ridge line finally collapsed and the Union forces retreated back to Cemetery Hill and back through Gettysburg to Cemetery Hill, Doubleday had delayed the Confederate advance by an hour and a half, which was precious time for reinforcements to come up, and had inflicted fairly heavy casualties on A.P. Hill Corps and Ewell's Corps. Of all the regiments under Doubleday's command, all of them suffered more than 60% casualties, except for 3 regiments. On July 2nd, Army Commander George Meade replaced Doubleday with Major General John Newton, a more junior officer from another corps. The ostensible reason was that inaccurate report of 11th Corps Commander Howard that Doubleday's corps broke first, causing the entire Union position to collapse. Doubleday was humiliated by this snub and held a lasting grudge against Meade. But he returned to his division command at Gettysburg and fought well with that on the second and third day. On the 7th, Meade relieved him of a battlefield command and sent him back to Washington. Doubleday's staff had nicknamed him 48 Hours. That was his nickname, as a compliment to recognize his tendency to avoid reckless and impulsive actions and his thoughtfulness and deliberateness in considering circumstances and possible responses. However, in recent years, historians and biographers have turned the nickname more into an insult, incorrectly claiming that 48 Hours was coined to highlight his supposed incompetence and slowness to act. In Washington, he was placed in charge of courts martial, and that gave him legal experience, which he used after the war. He testified against Meade at the United States Congress Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War and remained Meade's enemy after the war. He remained a loyal Republican and a staunch supporter of President Lincoln, and he actually accompanies Lincoln to Gettysburg when Lincoln goes to deliver the Gettysburg Address. Doubleday and his wife often accompanied the Lincolns to various events in Washington, but obviously not on the Ford Theater event. After the Civil War, he was mustered out of the volunteer service, but remained with the Army and was placed first in charge of the 35th U.S. Infantry in the West, and then in 1871 took command of the 24th U.S. Infantry in Texas, which was the all African American unit, nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers. This is where Doubleday and baseball were linked for the only time. Doubleday asked his superiors to, quote, purchase baseball implements for the amusement of the men at camp, unquote. He retired in 1873, wrote 2 books, one of which I have on the table here, and died of heart disease in 1893. His body lay in state in New York City at City Hall, and then he was taken to Washington by train to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, that's his stone there. Next slide, please. He and his wife never had any children. Next slide. So how does Doubleday get connected with baseball? Okay. No serious historian believes that Doubleday established the rules of baseball, laid out the shape of the diamond and the distances and things like that, but the myth still persists. Early colonists to the United States brought with them the games of rounders and cricket. That was in the 1700s. By the early part of the 19th century, there were a number of different ball games being played throughout the United States, including town ball, rounders, and cricket. By the 1850s, what will become baseball, and what is being called now baseball, was vying with cricket as the most popular field game. The cricket crowd didn't want the riffraff, so it cost a quarter to observe a cricket game. Those playing the game of baseball didn't mind the riffraff. They only charged the nickel. So financially, cricket died out, and baseball became the major ball game being played. The Civil War offered the opportunity for men from different parts of the country to see and participate in sports when not fighting. And The Civil War soldier, most of the time, was not fighting. Battles were limited in numbers, and there were long periods in between battles where they were in camp. Next slide, please. Now, there's a famous print of baseball being played at Salisbury Prison in North Carolina here. This is the print. Salisbury Prison was a nice prison in 1862. Prisoners of war, Union prisoners of war, there commented that if they had to be in a prisoner of war camp, they wanted Salisbury because the food was better there. And this is one depiction of baseball being played at Salisbury. Later in the war, Salisbury is bad like Florence and Andersonville and Elmira. Next slide, please. There's one photograph of baseball being played. These are Union soldiers at Fort Pulaski in Georgia playing baseball. It's called playing baseball. Next slide, please. Maybe they were playing cricket. And of course, baseball was in political cartoons. Next slide, please. And even after the war, there were reminiscences of baseball being played in prisoner of war camps. Next slide, please. This is an image you will not find on the internet. My Northern Civil War Roundtable, we designed commemorative envelopes and sold them at reenactment events. And we were at one event when a gentleman came up to us. He was a dealer in Civil War stamps and letters, and he said, "I have an image that you guys should put on an envelope and on a T-shirt." And he handed us his card. And his name was Elwin Doubleday, a member of the Doubleday family. And indeed, he sent us an email of a piece of stationery that belonged to the 76th New York Infantry, volunteer infantry, which was stationed at Camp Doubleday, one of the many camps that surrounded Washington. And in the image that's on the letterhead, a soldier writing a letter home to his family marks the hospital bed. He marks the test pen. He marks the distance here towards Slocum, so we know that he's working towards Washington. And it's depicting camp life and letter playing baseball. Here's the mat. They took it to the ball. Then the picket duty, baseball term. Call your attention to this man here. This is a lithograph that was on the letterhead of the stationery, and we assumed that this was just an artist drawing a lithograph of camp life. Then we discovered the letter that this soldier was writing home, and we realized in reading the letter that the lithograph is based on a photograph. And there were two photographers in Washington who took about several hundred pictures of camp life in the camps that surrounded Washington, but only about 45 to 50 of them have survived. This image is not one of the survivors. Let me show you the letter. Next slide. Next slide, please. This is the third paragraph of the letter. He writes, I wanted you to see the picture of Fort Massachusetts and Camp Doubleday and Fort Slocum and our camp. You will please take notice of a man that stands pretty near to one of the sentinel on the right, who you will perceive is watering his horse, or rather spraying a leak, just at the time the picture was taken. In other words, this man is urinating at the time the photograph was taken. So we obviously know that this is a photograph because of, an artist drawing this doesn't need much time to draw someone. So next slide, please. Now, how does Doubleday get this connection? Well, in 1905, Abraham G. Mills was appointed by Albert G. Spaulding, who is the father of the Spaulding Sports Goods Company, to head a commission to determine when and where baseball began. Spaulding was engaged in a dispute with Henry Chadwick, a British-born man who believed the game evolved from the English game of rounders. Spalding, typical of the hyper-Americanism of the late 19th century and early 20th century, that's when the United States flexed its muscle. Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly, carry a big stick. The White Fleet makes the tour around the world. So in that time period, Spalding believes that baseball was invented in America by an American, not someone from England. So he appoints this commission. The Mills Commission decision was released in 1908 and stated that Abner Doubleday invented baseball at Cooperstown in 1839. The commission based its decision on a letter sent to a newspaper by an Abner Graves of Denver, who claimed that he had seen Doubleday making drawings of baseball, the diamond, and measuring out distances. He said he also attended school with Doubleday and played with Doubleday. Having acquired the, quote, evidence they needed, no one bothered to check further about Graves. No one thought it was important that Graves was only 5 years old in 1839, and that Doubleday was already a cadet at West Point, having been there from 1838 to 1838 to 1842. And records at West Point clearly show that he did not request leave to go home at any point during that time. So Doubleday is not in Cooperstown from 1838 to 1842, when Graves says that he saw Doubleday inventing baseball, his 5-year-old. They didn't look at Graves' history particularly well either, because Graves was not well. He winds up killing his wife, and he will spend his remaining years in an insane asylum. So all of this flies in the face of Doubleday inventing baseball. But once the myth was established, and Doubleday was a Civil War hero, all that fit together. So, coupled with the dubious conclusion that baseball had no connection to any foreign game, gave the owners the ammunition they needed to promote baseball as the national pastime. This is the field in Cooperstown in 1920 that Doubleday supposedly laid out his baseball diamond. And Cooperstown said, well, if this is the place where baseball was invented, we can't have it just as a field. Next slide, please. So eventually they build Doubleday Field. This is a picture in 2021. Next slide, please. Cooperstown is a beautiful town. You can see the field is right in the middle of town. Up in the corner there is the Otesaga Hotel, which is like the big hotels in Pinehurst. And the lake is Glimmerglass Lake, and there's the opera house that sits on the lake. This is a beautiful area. Now, why was the Hall of Fame? Well, it seems logical. If you're going to establish a baseball Hall of Fame, you should do it where baseball was invented. And the Edwin Clark, who came to Cooperstown to practice law with a friend, and one of the clients that they get is a gentleman by the name of Isaac Merritt Singer, who invents the Singer sewing machine. And Clark realizes that this is a great invention, so Clark buys half of the stock of Singer and retires from law and becomes a millionaire. He becomes president of Singer, and he's responsible for the concept of the installment plan. So revenues increase. And Clark, who went to Cooperstown just as he builds a nice house there as a vacation home, but he falls in love with the area. So he and the next 4 generations of Clarks stay in Cooperstown. Stephen C. Clark Sr. is part of the family. He's a philanthropist, art collector, and he's seeking ways to celebrate and protect the national pastime. And he's also looking for an economic engine for Cooperstown. So Clark asked National President Ford C. Frick if he would support the establishment of a Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Frick welcomes the idea, and in 1936, the inaugural Hall of Fame class of Ty Cobb, Walter Johnson, Christy Mathewson, Babe Ruth, and Honus Warner were selected. Next slide, please. So now you know the story. Oh, this is Baseball Hall of Fame. Next slide, please. So now you know the story of the connection between baseball and Fort Sumter through Doubleday, who was stationed there, who fires the first shot against the Confederacy and does not invent baseball. Any questions? I have some paraphernalia here you can come up and look at. I'm a stamp collector, so I have some first day covers with the Doubleday stamp and other stamps, replica letters, replica newspapers of the times. And if you want to read some books, I have 4 books that I would recommend that are very good. Thank you. Remember, next week will be, did you know that Lincoln's law clerk was the first Union officer killed in the war? And Lincoln refers to this man as my younger brother. Okay. So was I. That was me. You were the big pediatric group. Isn't it amazing how those things happen? I still give those if you want.